And now we want to build a city together, the city of the future where we will live well and enjoy living. But it won't be easy because cities are getting bigger and bigger. Living is becoming more and more expensive there, and the air quality is often poor, and I could go on with challenges on the way. But that's exactly why we invited 3 particularly great guests to discuss how we can master all of these challenges. Please welcome those guests with us. There they are. Welcome Natalia Olson-Urtecho. She's the COO of RadicalxChange. That's a community of activists, artists, entrepreneurs, and scholars committed to using mechanism design to inspire radical social change. And well, Natalia did many things, but among them she worked for the Obama administration, and she's a smart city expert. Hi, Natalia. Ian Fletcher is also with us. He's a senior lecturer at the Leeds School of Architecture. In his research, he focuses on concepts and technologies that could help cities to become self-sufficient. And he's also working on new biological materials to build houses, one of them being, well, not mushrooms, but kind of mushrooms. Hi, Ian. Great to have you with us.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for the introduction.
And then right in the middle, there's Sebastian Hofer, whom many of you probably know from his wonderful column at 1E9. Sebastian is also the host of a podcast called Freifahrt, and he's a consultant and an expert on urban mobility solutions, especially micromobility. Hi, Sebastian.
Hey, thanks for the warm introduction.
First of all, maybe each of you could tell us in which cities you've already lived, or which cities you know pretty well. And maybe after that, you could also tell us which city you like best and why. And Natalia, maybe you start.
I grew up all over the world as a U.S. diplomat. So when people ask me that question, which is your favorite city? I always say, well, it depends where you were at a particular time in history. And, I love Mexico City. I was a teenager in Mexico City, 24 million people, very vibrant. I was a professional. My first time as a professional was in Budapest, in Hungary. And it was after the wall came down and went from communism to the next, free economy. And it was fascinating. I lived in Shanghai, the World Expo in 2010, and there's so many things happening. And every city is so special. So I just think that, for me, Philadelphia is my hometown. So, yeah, Philly, especially in these elections.
Absolutely. We saw a lot of Philadelphia in the last few days. Great. So we have a true global citizen. Ian, but you are also a real global citizen. Maybe you can tell us about the cities you've already lived and which one you like best and why.
Yes, indeed. So I was born and grew up on the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in the West Indies. And for my architectural education, it took me to cities like Berlin, New York, Montreal, Ottawa, and Manchester. I currently live in Manchester and work in Leeds. And to say whether or not to have a favorite, yeah, it's a bit tricky because I equally enjoyed every place I was fortunate enough to live in. And, really thankful for the experiences that I gained. So, so I'm going to be a bit neutral here and say I enjoyed all equally, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I see we see a pattern there, but it's not a very specific one. Sebastian, what about you?
I'm not such a global citizen, at least. I mean, I traveled a lot, but I haven't lived in so many exotic places. I grew up somewhere between Hamburg and Munich, and then I actually came back to study in Munich, where I lived for a couple of years. Then I lived in Koblenz and in Frankfurt, in Berlin, half a year in Pisa in Italy, and since 3 years, I'm back in Hamburg. And the reason is that this is the place which I like best. So the answer is definitely Hamburg, because you have a beautiful combination of cultural diversity, architecture, beautiful architecture, and the proximity to the seaside is like hugely important for me.
Now, if I listen to you, well, I get to think that there are no problems because it's so great to live in every city on this planet, but I guess you do see some problems because cities are growing everywhere, and this adds to existing challenges. In your point of view, what are the biggest problems that metropolitan areas are facing or will be facing in the next years from your point of view? Natalia, maybe you want to start again.
Well, I come from a country, when it comes to Europe, it's tougher to compare to the U.S. So the U.S. is a very young country. We have a very big difference between the rural area, little towns, not very big cities, and therefore we have to make sure that we start talking about regional cooperation. And a lot of little towns and cities in certain areas don't tend to integrate so well with the larger metropolitan areas. And I think, look, living in China, having been in Mexico, Brazil, now in Barcelona, the region is a very important thing, especially when it comes to infrastructure. And that communication is key. And I think that in my country, the US, our big deficiency is that communication between that small rural town, which is in West Virginia, which is an hour and 20 minutes away from the capital of the US, Washington, D.C. And the difference is tremendous as to how we coordinate within a small town city infrastructure and a bigger city infrastructure. And I think that's where we have a lot of things to fix, is that communication. Because in Europe, you're very lucky. You can be anywhere, and within an hour, you have a train. We don't have that. In Latin America, we are still trying to figure out the last mile, and we still try. We have awful infrastructure, and so we're still trying to figure out different aspects where. U.S., even though it's a very rich country, I'm comparing to Colombia, which has a great, bus infrastructure. But if you compare that to Venezuela or Bolivia or Argentina, very different. So I'm just bringing it from a global context of what that means. And I think communication, thinking regionally, and figuring out the last mile is really important.
Okay, so there's not enough communication between cities, between the regions around cities, and there are problems regarding the last mile. Ian, what challenges do you see?
Yeah, from a designer's perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges of our time will be climate change. So if you were to put buildings in perspective, buildings are hugely complicit in the crisis. Together, buildings and construction contribute 39% of the world's carbon footprint, which is almost 40%. The energy we use to heat, cool, light our buildings account for 28% of those emissions, with households being the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. The remaining 11% of buildings' carbon emissions are associated with construction and building materials. So the waste associated with the materials we make. So from an architectural perspective, the problems we're faced with, especially our cities, would be renewable energy generation, waste reduction, and material sustainability.
All right, that's a completely different perspective. And now let's add a third one, and Sebastian's challenges for us.
I think one of the main challenges that we are also very much angry in traffic. I don't know how you experience this, but if I'm on my daily commute, if I'm out there in the streets, I experience lots of angriness of car owners who are angry at cyclists, pedestrians are angry at cyclists, cyclists are very much angry in terms of the driving style of car owners. So I think this anger is a huge issue in traffic that we need to come over with. And I think one of the reasons is that we have so many private cars, and private cars are something that we probably, or at least I'm going to talk a little bit more in this panel, obviously, but I think they're the reason for lots of issues that we have in our current mobility culture. It's everything from congestions and uneven, unfairly divided public space, the money that we use to subsidize the streets, which refers to what Ian just said. So the concrete on the floor that we need to drive on them, calling them streets. That we have dangerous and life-threatening traffic. That we have social segregation based on all kinds of mobility service offerings. And yeah, I think this is mainly because of the fact that we based our mobility around the usage of private cars.
Okay, so I think we leave it up. We leave it here with the challenges. We could add thousands more, but that would make our task more difficult. So let's stay with this one. Natalia, you said that communication is a big issue. How can we overcome these issues? You know, you've been out in the field by yourself. How do you get a better communication between cities, the regions, and all the different players within?
This is where public policy comes into play. And this is where you have to have a balance between the private sector and the public sector. So sometimes the public sector doesn't communicate as well with the citizenry. And people are not being brought to the center. Citizens don't feel like they're being engaged. And the public sector sometimes feels that they know what they're doing and they're not integrating the public, opinion. They're not getting them into the conversation. And then what happens then was that the private sector gets really frustrated because they're the ones putting the money towards building certain buildings and certain developments, and they're like figuring out ways that they can actually make some money out of this, but trying to do the right thing. And I think that's where I come about is communication of what are the long-term goals, and that's why RadicalxChange is so important, because we are promoting and we have great models, economic models, where we're saying there's a way for the citizenry to have a more active voice, a more active participation. You can vote on how the certain infrastructure projects get decided on. Because it used to be like you could just vote yes or no on something and not have any leeway. And what RadicalxChange brings to the table is saying, no, you have a leeway. You have a way to figure out one way or the other, but to stay involved. And so what proved to me in these past elections in my country is that a lot of people didn't used to vote. Now everyone's like, oh no, I think I should vote. I think I should be involved. And it's a very different perspective compared to Latin America or Europe or Africa or many other countries. We're not very active in voting. We're not very active in being part of the government decisions. And I think that today, that's a very different picture. We have to figure out how to be actively involved so our voice is heard at every single part of this.
Thanks. And yeah, we just saw that many people want to get involved. The turnout was amazing. Now you are working on solutions for the communication issue, and Ian, you are developing concepts to address the climate crisis. Before we look at some pretty impressive designs from one of your seminars at university, maybe you tell us what approaches you are taking to make buildings and cities more sustainable.
Yeah, so I'm currently involved in a PhD project, and the primary objective is to evaluate the production, properties, and performance of mycelium biocomposites. So using fungi as the main organism to bioengineer materials. What I'm also trying to do is to look at the different influence of different locally sourced organic waste streams. So what we're trying to do is identify biopolymers, specifically cellulose, from organic waste streams to utilize for the production of mycelium biocomposites. And the whole purpose of this project is to try and identify material replacements which could be used in construction, because the benefits of these materials, especially live-in biomaterials, is they are 100% biodegradable, and they do have the ability, because they use the energy from organisms to manufacture the material, to sequester carbon.
Now that was a bit technical, but you know, fascinating anyway. Now let's add something for the eyes. We have a concept that's called damaged earth, and we have 2 pictures of it. Let's have a look at it.
Yeah.
Now that's the first one, and we have a second one. Now, can you tell us about this project? What does damaged earth mean, and what's this solution?
Yeah, so in this scenario, the project envisions future whereby regeneration is used as a tool for future urban developments, which uses natural systems for the creation of renewable energy, food, and biomaterials. So what happens is the project uses biophilic conditions and native species of algae and moss, along with recycled steel, to create a variety of living facades. So for example, moss facades are used throughout the north of the building, which acts as a natural air purifier against atmospheric pollutions, while the southern facades use algae bioreactors to produce biofuel and for heating and cooling the building. And the previous image at ground floor, the structure is elevated to optimize on-site growth conditions. What this does is it creates a series of social and public spaces, such as the kelp farm. And the kelp farm harnesses and grows brown kelp, which can be farmed for food, and the production of alginate, which is basically a polysaccharide, which could be used to manufacture biomaterials, anything from pharmaceuticals, etc., etc.
Wow. And we have another fascinating one. It's called Oasis. Let's have a quick look at this too, and maybe you can tell us about the concept behind it as well.
Yeah.
What's the Oasis?
Yes. So in this scenario, the city of Manchester is predicted to be plagued with extreme flooding and rising water levels due to increased rainfall, which is one of the effects that will be experienced in the UK. We will experience extreme flooding and increased rainfalls due to climate change. So what the project does here is it speculates that future residents will be forced with no option than to seek refuge on higher ground, adapting the city's existing high-rise infrastructure to promote their livelihood. So in this post-apocalyptic water world, towers will be used and readapted to become social hubs, which will provide reliable sources of food and power with spaces for social interaction and commerce. So the tower uses a variety of sustainable technologies for food production, such as 3D farming, vertical gardens, and allotments, along with hydroponic systems. In additionally to this, it generates its own sustainable energy using vertical air wind turbines and rainwater harvesting systems. So this is what you can see here as a vision of the future of what our architecture would look like to combat extreme flooding within Manchester.
Great. Well, not great that Manchester probably gets flooded, but the concept is fascinating. Thank you, Ian. And now we turn to Sebastian, who could also provide some solutions for the problem that he was mentioning, the anger on the street. Sebastian, you for your podcast in your articles for 189, you talk to many people who are working for e-scooter companies, for major corporations, for urban planning. What solutions are out there that could solve the problem that you mentioned, the anger?
Maybe you have to talk to psychotherapists instead of talking to urban planners for that one. But I think I would like to relate to what Natalie said. The collaboration and the communication is something that everybody, literally everybody in my podcast points out all the time. Like there's a lack of collaboration. If you ask mobility service providers, then they're always worried that the dependence on aggregator apps will lose or make them lose the contact to the customers, and they're dependent on them eventually. If you talk to public transport operators, they are worried about cannibalization of all kinds of sharing services. If you talk to software companies, they tell me that their increasing of efficiency, which should be a good thing, leads to worried customers saying, what if you're bought by or acquired by a major tech company? So there's lots of fear and not much of positive moving into a more desirable future. And if you ask me who's owning the narrative, or I think the vision that you're talking about, the comprehensive vision, I would like to divide the future scenario into two groups. So the one group is talking about technology mainly, technology like autonomous driving, urban air mobility, or drones or air taxis, however you want to call them, sharing of vehicles at all costs as one business model and one future scenario. And especially if you look into future scenarios that are coming from motor companies or automobile companies, they're usually these little autonomous pods hovering around the city and not many people there. So I would plead for that we need to design a future mobility which serves the people and the society. And therefore you have the other group, and this is the group of architects, sociologists, urban planners, who are questioning this approach, this technological approach, and they're asking, how is all of this impacting the quality of life of our city in terms of physical and mental health, in terms of social interaction, happiness, and obviously emissions, carbon emissions, in order to tackle what Ian is talking about and working on with quite fascinating projects, I have to say. So I don't have an answer, and I don't think anybody really has right now. So wouldn't say the vision is a technological vision, but I think the vision is more like how we want to do it. And I think one very important part to add on this is that if we want to have a different mobility culture and service offering than the private car that I criticized in my initial statement, is that we need an appealing set of options that together are better than the bundle of options that a car actually is. Because if you think about a car, a private car is something that gets you everywhere, anytime, for very, very little cost, if you really think about it. And therefore, we need a bundle of options which is more appealing and also more resource oriented. And therefore, I would plead for a city which doesn't allow any vehicles into the city anymore, apart from the ones that are made for the specific trip. And by this, I mean micromobility vehicles, for example, for individual trips into zipping from A to B, somewhere between 0 and 5 kilometers, and maybe tiny two-seaters or electric cargo bikes that help you transport stuff around the city, or maybe bring your kids to kindergarten or to school. I think that is very, very important to think of this this resource-oriented approach compared to what I just said with serving the people of the city.
All of you, especially Natalia, mentioned that every citizen has a voice, and you are all citizens of cities. So I said in the beginning that we want to build a city together. Now let's get concrete. Each of you, you can put some things to our wish list of elements that the city of the future should have. Natalia, maybe you want to add your wishes, like what you want to have the city of the future to have first.
So, you know, I was part of the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals in Paris in 2015. And mobility and innovation was my big part, and how we were going to promote entrepreneurship and innovation in this area. We can't do that without good vision and mission from political parties where we have certain public policies in place. We cannot have autonomous vehicles in areas that there's no infrastructure for it, and there's no legal binding, no legal issues that protect the citizen or protect the driver. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. And I think that for the city of the future, and I'm bringing this from a policy perspective, we can talk about design, we can talk about great ideas, but unless we have the legal infrastructure to protect innovation and protect the driver, protect the user, protect the people, and you know, also the people who are actually are upset because their cars. We talk about cities where we're saying we don't want cars anymore. And I'm in Barcelona, and people are really upset here because all of a sudden they were told, you know, cars that are over 12 years old, you can't use them anymore. What happens to the users of those cars when they cannot access their jobs? They cannot access where they're going. There's no transition. So there's no transition planning. There's no, and when you don't have transition planning, you have no resilience. Because what you need to do when you're trying to create the city of the future is to create a resiliency against issues that might happen that will attack that vision to be the city of the future.
A legal framework, you want, you know, public policy that's involved, and you want urban resilience for the city of the future. Ian, what would you add to the wish list?
Yeah, my wish will be for buildings to be more responsive to their natural environment. They will use bioengineered living materials to reduce inefficient industrial construction processes. They'll be able to metabolize their own waste while reducing pollution. But in addition to this, they'll be able to generate their own energy from renewable sources and be able to create high value products. Last but not least, they should be able to modulate their microbiome to benefit human health and well-being above all.
Okay, and Sebastian, you can also add some things.
Building on the legal infrastructure, I would like to see specific KPIs that could be a happiness index, some kind of welfare health index, and then competition amongst mobility service operators in order to keep the quality up, because otherwise we can see that public transport usually lacks some very high quality standards and comfort. But since the conference is also called A New Humanity, I would go a little bit away from specific mobility services, but I would say that we need a little bit more mindfulness and virtue in order to go away from this ego-centric system to a more eco-centric system, if I may quote Otto Scharmer.
Whoever you want. Now let's ask our control centrum and Muriel if there are questions from the audience. Muriel, your turn. Well, I'm yelling at her, but she's not hearing me. You're on.
A question?
Yeah, it's our question.
I'm sorry. Sorry, I was too deep dived into your conversation. So we have actually one super hands-on question. So what can I do myself to help make my own city sustainable?
Who wants to pick this question first? Natalia, go for it.
Absolutely. Look, I was a planning commissioner and zoning commissioner, and these are volunteer positions. I mean, I was appointed by the mayor, but that's because I was so persistent on making sure that Philadelphia was a more modern city, and that I went to planning school in Philadelphia, went to University of Pennsylvania, and I said, I studied planning. I had great ideas. I'm not going to let my plans sit on a shelf. So I made a point of reaching out to every public official. And I said, this is what we need. This is what we need. And I'm a very charming nagger. And so, anyone can be, you are a citizen of your city, of your town, of your state. You have the right to go ahead and get involved. Your taxpayer money, you being there is integral to the future of a city, of a region, and a state. You will not be left to the side, and you should be involved. Don't complain if you have not tried to be involved. Just get involved, and that is so important. Just do it. You'll be surprised how happy and how it's frustrating, but at the same time, so rewarding.
So get
and I would build on this and say that getting involved also means starting with yourself in terms of mobility. Again, I would suggest to think about the consequences, the externalities that of your way of getting around actually produces. So CO2 emissions, for example, space that you consume, if you use a private car, for example, and then start to experiment with different options of mobility, since usually they bring about much more fun and joy, and also maybe getting to know other people. And eventually you can tell others about it and inspire others to change this tiny little bit in their daily life, like you did.
Ian, you have another recommendation.
Yes, I would like to add, and this is where I have to put on my economics hat, and Natalia summed it up beautifully. We need to rethink our mixture of philosophy, environmentalism, and economics, but most importantly, it has to be people-centered, because we have to encourage people to take ownership to meet our future goals, and our current models currently don't do that. We rely on government to make these sort of, to rely on good governance and legislation, which doesn't come. And I think good governance and legislation is key for any change, especially for futures of the city and addressing climate change and environmentalism. And that's why I stand with it. I really do think we need to go back to the human scale and encourage people to participate more and get more involved.
Great. So I sum it up: get on the nerves of local officials, but do it with a smile, and try out new things. But get involved.
Yes.
You have a voice, and make it heard. And you have a voice here too. That's why we ask again if there are new questions from the audience. And this time the Kontrollzentrum is listening, I guess.
Yes, yes, I did. So beside us as humans, how do the concept of a sustainable city and a smart city fit together? Can smart technology support sustainability?
Who wants to take this first?
Yeah, I think we need a mix. So basically, like, I think at the moment, because we've got these separate entities, our philosophy, environmentalism, and economics are so separate. Our current system, economic system particularly, is dehumanizing. So decisions are made purely on profit, and this is where I think a sort of shift in our sort of philosophy has to come, because we have to sort of factor in human and environmental need, and this can be well-being, happiness, mobility, accessibility, interconnectivity, green spaces, you know, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. So this is where I think, you know, there's this, you know, there's a lot of talk about the green economy, and I think this is very, very instrumental, because what we need to do is we need to unleash a new type of industrial revolution where we empower people to find solutions within their local district, which can be supported and funded by federal and provincial government. And I think this is one of the key things. So I do think that smart technologies and technologies will play an instrumental role, but it's not the only solution that we need. And I think most of it will come from sort of human collaboration and speaking to each other and petitioning governments to be better and to fund projects and innovative ideas to help solve the problems that we're going to be faced with in the next century.
Sebastian, Natalia, maybe. Yes, Natalia, please.
Yeah, let's talk about, for example, technology has become part of our lives just in the last 22, 23 years. And technology is not the answer to everything. But in the last, couple of decades, it's become an answer, a very quick answer. And I think we're entering a realm of where technology plays a role, and where humanism plays a role. And I think because it's so new, it's that we're trying to figure this out, that there has to be a very honest conversation between our big tech companies, big technologists, our civic tech people, and our stakeholders, where they're actually like, where do we come to a middle? Because we've been using this as a way to solve things, and technology doesn't solve everything.
Sebastian, maybe you want to talk about a smart city approach too, because many of the mobility solutions that you already mentioned before wouldn't work without technology. So which role could a smart technology play in a sustainable city?
I highly resonate with what the other two said, because I also think that technology isn't the solution. And also, I think if you think of mobility, then mobility is there to serve a basic need, and it's not an end in itself, but it a means for something else, I think. And if smart mobility, if combined mobility, like let's say algorithms that are pooling people together in order to make more use of the resource of a car, bringing you from A to B, like minibuses, and all kinds of in the world, which are being tested right now, then obviously this is a smart move and a good move towards more sustainability. But I think technology usually, and smart city, the idea of a smart city using technology for use cases or for enabling use cases, sometimes to me seems like an easy approach because the more complex question is how to reframe humanity, how to reframe society. That's what the others just said in a very, very beautiful way. And technology can't do that, but technology is very easy because you can develop it, put it out there, and tell a very, very interesting story. And therefore, it's probably sometimes more appealing to use that instead of asking the more the bigger and more complex question.
It's easier to go
and Natalia, could you please hold your mic up again?
I'm sorry. No, it's so easy to go ahead and have a tech answer than to have answer from the stakeholders and the community. Because when you go out to the stakeholders and you go out to the community and you go out to the neighborhoods and you're talking to people, it's a tough thing. It's easier when you just, hey, let me send an email, let me send a I did this when SurveyMonkey got started again, first started 20 years ago. I used them to get better answers because we used to only ask a small group of people. But now I think that we really need to have a better understanding of the fact that who we're asking, the character, the personality, better demographic analysis of who and how, because each neighborhood is different, each street, each commercial corridor is different. And I think sometimes we make decisions as policymakers or urban planners based on some big ideas and not based on what is the best for that local community. So I always say, look, let's think locally. It makes an impact.
Thank you. I think there went something wrong in the middle with your mic. You were we could hear you, but not very loud. So maybe you could check if your mic is still put in correctly. And in the meantime, I check if there are more questions from the audience.
We have. We also have a question actually from Tobias, our former keynote speaker. So, where would you see the key starting points for changing the communications from large-scale institutions to function people-centric? And is communications the main challenge?
Natalia, let's try your microphone again.
I would say, yeah.
Natalia, could you say something?
Yeah, I think communication is the main challenge. I mean, that's always been the case. And this is where we go wrong. It's because we think that we understand what certain groups of people are saying, but because we're not involving them on their everyday, analysis and everything, we tend to go wrong. And so we have to have a more open. That's where technology comes into place. This is where we have to have a humanistic perspective of technology. Is how do we get technology to be not just one thing or the other, and choosing one or the other. It's about figuring out how each person's data, how each person's human perspective is respected and is actually incorporated.
Sebastian, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking of what Charles Taylor says, and he speaks of future imaginaries as a way to design the future. And the idea is that if you have, think about the Fifth Element movie where you have flying cars, or for example, artificial intelligence, or The Matrix, like all these science fiction movies from the past, which created images in our minds where we as a collective kind of believe or accept that this is the future, and then we try to develop technology in order to get there eventually, like floating hoverboards from Back to the Future. All these funny technologies where all kinds of engineers in the world try to make the science fiction movies reality. And another idea, or another approach towards the question of communication, I think, is also marketing and the narratives that are being out there. If you think of why we all, for example, buy cars or why we use public transport, then if you think of the billboards and the marketing campaigns of different companies, then this is something which is extremely and very deeply rooted in our decision making, because of course we want to be the hero, we want to be the cool guy who sits in the roadster with a beautiful woman next or right or left of him driving into the sunset, because this is appealing. This is something that you want to be as well. And if you look at the other side, then there's hardly anything which is appealing enough, or if that which you could compare to this imagery, this very, very strong marketing image. And therefore the other side, like the side of sustainable mobility, needs a new narrative, a new imagery as well.
But I guess the question was even more concrete about how could we get these big entities, cities, governments, public transport companies to involve people in a better way. Sebastian, you worked with public transport companies. Could you maybe tell about your experiences there?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've been thinking about this since recently, actually, how to solve this issue, because public transport, of course, has the issue that they have to solve problems for everybody, literally everybody, because this is the idea of public provision, that you design something which everybody in a city can use. Unfortunately, though, public transport used to, and I think in most of the cities still sees the customer as goods to transport around the city. So they don't see the customer as a customer, but as some kind of good. And on the other side, if you look at the private companies, the private mobility companies, they come from they want to increase profit, and what Ian already explained. And therefore, I think some middle ground could be the idea of cooperatives, where you give people a reason to care, and where you involve people in a way they don't just consume mobility, but they also have a reason to care and participate and co-create a mobility service offering in a city, instead of just consuming it and again criticizing public transport, for example, because they don't do or they don't provide a more comfortable or cheaper or more frequently driving service in your city.
Now, unfortunately, we are already.
This conversation.
I'm sorry, we are already, but you get a last point, so maybe you can edit there. So we are at the end of this panel, but Natalia, maybe it fits you. Maybe you can tell us if you want to leave. Okay, it's amazing. Okay, I'm sorry, I shut up. Natalia said it's amazing. Please go for it.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's amazing because when things don't work, the private sector comes in. So all the sharing economy, the fact that you have Uber, the fact that you have, Lyft, the fact that you have an entire system coming in to make sure that things work is where we're at, right? Some things don't work. How do we get the private sector? How do we get the stakeholders to be part of this conversation to improve what the government hasn't done so well? Because you have to understand, we keep thinking that mobility is a public good, but when you don't have innovation and you don't have the private sector at the table and to make it better, then we don't get good results. And this is where we really need to come together in order for us to serve the public better, having all the stakeholders at the table. And the private sector is a big component of this. And I just think that we really need to do a better job of that.
So then we make a quick final round.
So.
All of you are still young, but when you are older, do you still want to live in the city or do you want to live on the countryside? Ian, you can start.
This is a very contentious thing for me, but for me, I think we need better urban spaces, which are people-centered. We've established that, but spaces that could produce and provide human interactions and promote human exchange. The reason why I say this is that with the hope of it springing an ethical and moral response to our environmental stewardship. And I think the way to do this is we have to try and integrate nature and environment into not only our economic model, but into the way we design our cities, so that when we do live in cities, 85% of the world population, we will not want to escape the city to go enjoy nature because it'll be right on our doorsteps.
Okay, so you want the countryside in the city. That's a good answer. Sebastian, what about you? You want to still live in the city when you're old, or you want to, you know, go back to the countryside?
I want to live in the city that Ian just drew. I love that. I was going to say,
yes,
I was going to say I want both, but this is the perfect match.
What about you?
Well, Barcelona and in Palo Alto, and in Barcelona, I can be in the mountain, and which is right now. I am actually in front of Plaza Catalunya, our main plaza. View of Plaza Catalunya. I can be in the beach in 5 minutes, and I can be in the mountain in 15. So I think that is an amazing city.
Yes, indeed.
And I think that's, you know, and one of the reasons why I choose to be here.
All right. Thank you so much, Natalia, Ian, and Sebastian, for this wonderful discussion and ideas about the city of the future.